Hi everyone, welcome to episode 2 of my pastry basics video. Let's do a quick recap of what we've seen in episode 1. I showed you 3 different recipes for pastry, how to make them, different techniques, and also different tools that you can use to make them. So in this episode, we're gonna focus on rolling the dough as a start. So I'm gonna show you a classic technique, which means you don't need anything except for a rolling pin. So I'm gonna grab one of those pastries that I made in episode 1 and I'm gonna show you how to roll it out. So you have to make sure that you have chilled your dough. It is important that it's still a bit pliable, otherwise you will struggle rolling it out. And just to make it a little bit easier, you can also cut it in half or in whatever size you actually want. So let's get started. I have a little bit of flour on my board here and a little on my rolling pin. Just try to keep the flour usage in general when you're handling pastry to the very minimum. So you want to do this applying a little bit of pressure. You might find, depending on which pastry you're making, you might find that it tends to crack, and that happens, it's quite normal. Just make sure that you keep applying pressure and try to close that gap as you roll the dough out. And also make sure that the pastry is not sticking to the surface. Just try to move it around as you roll it as much as possible. So this is quite a lot of pastry, so let me show you a different technique. You can do single portions. If you remember from episode 1, I had a pastry which I rolled into a log, which I'm showing here. So I did this on purpose because if you shape it like this, it's easy to just cut it into discs that you can later on treat as single portions. So it really depends on what type of thing you're trying to line. In my case, I have tart rings that I want to show you today. So they're quite small. That means I don't need a huge disc. So I start off with something relatively small. And this log gave me about 8 to 10 portions. And the rolling technique is the same at this point as I showed you previously. You just make sure that there's enough flour on the board, enough flour on your rolling pin, and you turn the pastry as you roll. Now, an optional trick is to use pastry strips like I have here. And these are great because they ensure that you get an even thickness throughout your entire pastry. The rolling pin will not touch your workbench. It will only touch the strips, and that's great for even thickness. Now, the second technique for rolling that I wanted to show you today is with parchment. And this is actually a favorite of mine because it's less messy. It ensures that you don't overuse flour, and it's much quicker to get cutouts out of the pastry. So I have one sheet of parchment right here. I'm just gonna take my dough out and place it there. And again, you want the dough to be cold but pliable, otherwise it's hard as a rock and you cannot roll it out without using a lot of force. And if you use a lot of force, you risk tearing the dough. So same technique, you roll, and because we want a nice and round shape, I turn the paper around. And this ensures that I get a nicer sort of shaped circle out of the pastry. Once you've done that, you can chill it a little bit before you cut out anything. But let me show you how easy it is to just peel it off. Perfect thickness. So now we're ready to move on and talk about the lining of rings. In this video, I'm talking about tart rings, but you can follow the same principles if you're talking about a pie dish, for example. So here I have a bunch of different tart rings. Some of them are perforated, some of them have borders like I'm showing here. the thickness or the width of the ring varies. So bear that in mind when you're trying to adapt a recipe. So here I have my ring, and my first approach is to do one single cutout that will fit the entire ring and that will form the entire shell. So I have a cookie cutter. This is actually a lid that I had lying around, which is a little bit bigger than the target tart ring. And that is because I wanted to cover the bottom, but also the sides of the ring. So let's get rid of the excess just before we get started. You can definitely reuse the scraps. The second batch won't be as nice in terms of texture, but definitely worth saving those. So I'm gonna put my cutouts in the fridge for them to chill out a little bit because I overworked it and the pastry was a bit soft for me to do anything with it. So now I'm gonna take the disc and I'm gonna fold in 4 corners into the center, placing it on the ring. My workbench is slightly coated with flour so that I can easily turn as I go. You want to give yourself a lot of room to work here and don't be afraid to just manipulate the ring as much as you need to. I'm gonna get rid of the excess with a rolling pin, and it's quite a lot of excess I've got here, but that's fine. A little more might come the second you start pressing into the sides of the ring. You want to do this to make sure that your sides don't collapse into the center. So I'm just gently pressing, I'm moving my ring as much as I need to, and I'm ready to just trim off the excess. Use the back of a knife, or you can also use an offset spatula for this. And it's rather easy to get rid of the excess bits. So this guy is ready, and again, anytime I'm done handling pastry, I just put things back in the fridge while I wait, while I preheat my oven, etc. Now moving on to my second approach. This is something very beloved with pastry chefs. And what we're doing here is just cutting out, using the exact same tart ring that we want to bake with, we're cutting out the bottoms. And same thing, we get rid of the excess, we place our rings already in the mat that we're gonna be baking with, and just take gently those bottoms and place them into your ring. Just getting my last one, and you might find that they don't fall perfectly into place. You might have to push them a little bit, give it a shake, press them slightly. Again, don't be afraid to rotate as you go. And once you're happy with those, we can put these back in the fridge while we work on the cutouts for the sides. Now for that, we are actually gonna try and roll our pastry as long as possible. So we want a nice long rectangle. Again, I would prefer normally to do this with the parchment method because it's just easier to roll out the dough without worrying that it cracks too much. If you do it without the parchment, it's very easy for you to get a bit of tearing here and there. But don't worry, pastry is actually rather forgiving. You can patch it up very easily, and in the end, you won't notice. So I'm just gonna cut some rough edges here. I want a nice and clean edge for my pie tarts. And I want it to fit in nicely at the bottom and also at the top. So I'm just eyeballing the width of my ring here, and I'm just gonna cut out a nice long strip. And I don't want to just pull the strip off of the bench. That would definitely tear something because it's so long. So you can just do what as I'm showing here, roll it into itself. Just make sure it's not sticking to itself. The dough is cool. It's not really difficult to work with. If your dough is too warm, then it will definitely stick onto itself. And after chilling my components for about 15 minutes in the refrigerator, I'm ready to build this shell. So I'm taking this beautiful cutout and I can just roll it onto the sides very easily. And once you reach the target length, you can just trim very carefully with a knife the excess and save it for a different case. And again, we want to make sure that the pastry is really touching the sides. So I'm gently pressing, and as I do this, I like to rotate the ring as much as possible. This also ensures that the pastry is not sticking to the bottom. Now let's get rid of that excess as I showed you earlier with my flat knife. Just take your time. It doesn't have to be perfect. I have some tips for you at the end of the video on how to make things prettier. So this is all very rustic so far, but this is actually a very professional way of making tart cases. You will see in lots of Instagram videos that this is what pastry chefs actually do. So those were the two methods, and you can just choose whichever one you like and find easiest. And now that we've covered this, it's time to move on to the baking part. And I'm going to show you different techniques and different experiments for all of these techniques and the end product, of course. So let's start with pâte sucrée. And let me show you some of the prep that you need to do for blind baking. But what does blind baking mean? Well, if you have a dessert that in the end will have a filling that doesn't need to go in the oven, then your shell needs to be fully cooked. So in that case, you want to use the blind baking method to ensure that the pastry was cooked properly and that your pastry has a nice golden brown color. And the problem with baking just the pie crust is that there's nothing preventing those air pockets coming from the fat in the pastry to burst up and cause uneven surfaces. You don't have the filling to prevent that. So you need some sort of weight on top of your cases to help with this problem. And there are two things that you can try. Some people like the docking method, which is just taking a fork like I'm showing you here and just pricking the surface of the pastry, also the sides. So I'm gonna just test this out and see what I get. And I'm also gonna do blind baking with some pie weights. And for that, I will use those parchment squares that I had because the pie weights shouldn't touch the pastry at all, because they might stick. So this is just gonna help us prevent that, and it will be a lot easier to take them out when they're done. So I'm testing as pie weights some rice, uncooked rice. This is in case you don't have ceramic beans, which I've shown earlier, and it works just as well. With any pie weight, you want to make sure that you fill it all the way to the top of your tart case. And you can see that my parchment squares are all wrinkly, and this is because I find that it's a lot easier to fit them in the tart case. So this is my test with ceramic pie weights. Again, filling all the way to the top. And let's do another one with just uncooked rice. Perfect. And the final one with ceramic beans. And I'm gonna have 2 ceramic beans. I'm gonna have one docked, one without anything at all, and 2 with rice. And I'm gonna bake this at 180 Celsius for about 12 to 15 minutes. And here we go. You can see that the one where I didn't do anything is pretty flat. It looks pretty good. And it's already golden brown. So I'm gonna take that out at this point. And this is thanks to all that lovely sugar in there. The one that was docked was also looking really nice. So test successful here. So let's remove the ones with some pie weights. Carefully lift, because if you get a little bit of crust attached to the parchment, then good luck. So I've got all my weights off, and you see that they're a lot paler. And that's because of the weight that prevented the browning. So we have to return these to the oven for another 10 to 12 minutes. And there we have it. They all look pretty flat at the bottom, to be honest. So it seems like for this particular pastry, there are no problems if you don't use pie weights. But of course, I'm only using tart rings here that are really small. It would be interesting to test what happens if you go for something larger, etc. But I just wanted to show you how to experiment with your own setup. Like I said, I have different tart rings, so there's a lot of things that one can test and debunk some of those myths online, actually. It could be that the perforated rings don't need the weights. I've seen that going around online. And I would be interested in testing it in different sized rings. So as you can see, for this pastry, we have a pretty even result for all the baking methods that I showed. So it seems pretty forgiving given the size of the ring, and I'm pretty happy with everything. So I think we can just end the pâte sucrée here and move on to the pâte sablé. And this is not my best work in terms of lining. You can see that I have a lot of patchwork done on these guys, but it doesn't matter too much because I'm gonna fill them anyway, so you can't really see these things. So I'm docking a few of these and putting some weights in some others, and I just want to see how this dough behaves. I've seen that it doesn't really matter if you have rice or ceramic pie weights, so I'm just going for rice here. And this pastry really didn't brown that much during the first baking process, so I'm taking the whole thing back in the oven after I remove the pie weights. So I'm removing the tart rings just when they're cool to avoid burning myself. They come out super easily. That's not an issue. They don't really stick to the ring. And I like the even coloring on all the tests for this pastry. I didn't see any major problems with air pockets bursting out of the pastry. And you can definitely see that this pastry has a much finer texture, very sandy. Finally, let's move on to pâte brisée, my personal favorite. This one has got the least amount of sugar, but that also means a lot more butter flavor. Maybe that's why I like it. I'm not sure. No, honestly speaking, it's the texture that I love because it's the flakiest crust and it's the most versatile. I use it for lots of things, not just tarts. So you know the drill. I'm just docking a few of these pie weights on a couple. Let's see what happens. So right off the bat, I see that the docked ones look great. I do see some air pockets in some of the ones without any weights. And generally with pâte brisée, you see that this pastry tends to shrink as it bakes. Some bakers actually tend to use excess pastry on their cases, under pie dishes, and then trim off after the first bake. Because it likes to shrink so much, you don't get a nicer edge like you would with the other pastries. But honestly, I personally don't care that much. All I care about is the texture, the taste, and it doesn't have to be the prettiest pastry as long as it melts in my mouth and it's super flaky. That's all I care about. And look at that. I just barely touched it and it broke apart because it's so tender. It's just crumbles in your mouth the second you bite into it. And it's beautifully golden, and that means it's gonna have a lot of flavor. Now, some bonus material for you: how to get perfect edges, shiny shells, and how to use it in other things. All of this I'm covering right here, right now. Let's start with getting the perfect edges. So I have a slightly bigger tart case here because I wanted it to be obvious, and I've chosen a pâte sucrée shell to show you. You see that it's a little bit uneven at the top. So some secrets that you learn from pastry chefs is just to use a microplane zester or just a grater, like a cheese grater, and just go around the ring and sand that off. It's actually pretty effective, and you get a really nice and flat edge that looks just perfect, almost store-bought, I'd say. So that's trick number 1. Trick number 2, how to get beautifully shiny golden tart cases. The trick is to use an egg wash. An egg wash is an egg yolk with a little bit of water. You mix that together, and using a pastry brush, you just go around your perfectly cooked tart case and just brush some of that onto the bottom and the sides and the outer sides as well. Now you can't just eat that, you have to bake it for a little longer, for about 5 to 8 minutes in the same oven. And here we go. The one on the right hand side was prepared using the egg yolk, and the one on the left is really dull if you compare it to the one on the right, and that one has no egg wash. So there you have it. And obviously one of the main use cases for pastry is pies. So here's a little teaser for you of what's coming to my channel next. So don't forget to subscribe and to like this video.